Hello, and many thanks for joining us on the program. I am Imonia Marere. Have Western liberal democratic models, such as the U.S. presidential system and the United Kingdom's Westminster parliamentary system, failed Africa? Or have they failed to deliver the expectations of Africans? Are these liberal democratic systems at different levels of recession globally? Is it the political systems that are failing, or the inability of their practitioners in Africa to adapt them to their peculiar circumstances, aspirations, and the needs of their peoples? Former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo thinks that Western democratic models, borrowed or inherited by African countries, have failed and should be replaced with a homegrown African alternative system that addresses local needs and which factors in the people's culture, their traditions, and history. He calls it Afro Democracy. He argues that Western liberal democracy introduced the concept of opposition politics, or what he calls enemy politics, as against Africa's communalism, where decisions were made through consensus. Should Nigeria and other African countries heed his advice, retrace their steps, and adopt indigenously generated political systems? If they choose to, how long will it take to fashion out such a system that will be acceptable to all, especially in plural societies such as Nigeria, with sharply diverse cultures, traditions, and histories? Is the fault in the inherited or borrowed systems, or in the operation of poorly digested and perhaps misunderstood systems? What is the guarantee that any new system will not be corrupted and bastardized by political actors, as they are doing presently? Is Nigeria's American-style presidential system a major roadblock to the provision of good governance by successive governments in Nigeria? Has liberal democracy really failed those who originated it, as Obasanjo contends? The concept of Afro Democracy is described by the proponents as that which merges elements of African political traditions and values with modern democratic principles. It seeks to create a governance model that is rooted in African cultural context, while embracing democratic ideas such as participation, accountability, and human rights. It emphasizes community-based decision-making, respect for elders and traditional leaders, and the integration of indigenous practices into contemporary political systems. But is this what former President Obasanjo is referring to, or something more Afrocentric? According to his proponents, the goal is to develop a form of democracy that resonates with African societies and addresses the unique social, economic, and political challenges that they face. But critics of the concept say it presupposes that African societies are still stuck in pre-colonial and colonial social systems that now require some kind of blending and modernization. They argue that African societies have evolved into sovereign countries far beyond the cultures and traditions that promoted kingdoms and kings and entrenched autocracies and hegemonic rules. So, which should Africa take? Continue with its current democratic systems, or adopt the Obasanjo model of Afro democracy? These are the issues we'll be looking at today, and I'm joined in the studio by Professor Osareme Osumbo, former governor of Edo State in South Nigeria, a former senator, and a distinguished professor of law. Thank you so much, Prof, for finding time to join us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Great. We are also joined here in the studio by Dr. Hussein Abdul, a political scientist and country director of CARE. Thank you so much, Prof. Doc, for finding time to join us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, we also expect to join us very shortly Professor Yaya Tanko Baba. He is a professor of political institutions and comparative politics at the Department of Political Science, Usmanu Danfodio University in Sokoto. Thank you so much for finding time to join us, Professor Baba.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Right, so Professor Osareme Osumbo, let me begin with you. What do you make of Obasanjo's Afro Democracy concept?
Well, Imoni, you refer to it as President Obasanjo's Afro Democracy concept. I don't understand fully what that means, other than what you just read out to us. So for me to be able to respond and to answer, I need to understand exactly what he's referring to. The onus is on him, the proponent of the idea, to elucidate the full implications and ramifications of the ideas that he's proposing. I know about democracy. I can speak about democracy. I can define democracy. I understand the features and essential ingredients of democracy. But I cannot define for you what Afro democracy means, what the essential ingredients means, how power relationships at various levels, even with the traditional institutions. I don't understand how that can be fashioned out. So as I said, the onus is on those who are proposing this to really elucidate. Tell us what would be the relationships between these various cadres, the traditional institutions, the various segments of society. And you mentioned in your introductory remarks that there's no uniform African culture as such. When you say it should be Afrocentric, it presupposes that there's one African identity. But even within Nigeria here, you know that it's pluralistic. You don't have one single Nigerian culture. So I don't know how practicable it will be to fashion a democratic system that is modeled along one single cultural identity or multiple cultural identities. My fear is that this would introduce another level of experimentation. In my understanding of the political evolution of Nigeria, we've been bogged down by endless experimentations. Even now, people still refer to, they talk about the democratic experiment in Nigeria. Must we continue to experiment? So, in summary, my gut reaction about this idea of Afro democracy, it is another new angle to experimentation. We already have many years and experience of democracy. Why don't we identify the flaws in the system that we are operating? If it is succeeding elsewhere, it can succeed here. And in the first place, why the model that we adopted was adopted is that people felt it had merit over the original traditional system. Because the superior, the stronger, always, the laws of evolution from Darwin, that the superior always displaces the inferior. The stronger always displaces the weaker. So the fact that we imported this in the first place meant that it had stronger elements, stronger appeal than what we have on ground. Otherwise, it would not have succeeded in displacing it. And my illustration is China. China has been able to retain its system despite all the pressures. And they are succeeding with their own system, their own model. So we should try and improve on the model that we are practicing rather than begin a new journey on experimentation.
Okay, Dr. Abdul, President Obasanjo thinks that liberal democratic models, parliamentary, presidential, in whatever variant, they have been practiced in other places have failed, at least in Africa. And in fact, he says that they are even failing those who originated those models. And that is his justification for the option of Afro democracy.
Yeah, I think he's correct that liberal democracy is under tremendous stress globally. But this stress is not simply about the imperfections in the system, but is the coalition between liberal political framework and the liberal economic paradigm that had been adopted around the world, that has become almost the sole model, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the over-celebrations of the triumphal of democracy, or liberal democracy as it were. And increasingly, we are beginning to see elements of stress, whether it's in Europe or it's in the United States. You find examples of certain democratic backsliding or reversals. The whole emergence of right-wing populism across many countries in Europe, Poland being one of the major flag bearers of that right-wing populism. The challenges in the United States, particularly under Trump, and also what is going on now before the elections. The situation in Brazil before the return of Lula are examples that are often being put on the table to actually show that liberal democracy is under stress. But significantly, that stress is largely or also very much induced by the liberal economic framework that has tended to deepen poverty even in developed countries, that have increased the level of inequality even in the developed countries, that have actually skewed development to serve the few against the majority. And therefore, the reactions that people give is the reactions related to their social economic condition that is seen to be adopted or to be promoted by certain institutional framework and economic structures. This is probably slightly different from the situation in Africa. And many African countries were in the Huntingtonian understanding of the third wave of democratizations. And we've seen many countries in the last few years that have transited to, in the last 30 years, that have transited to democracy, including Nigeria. Many of them, these transitions happened from authoritarian rule, whether it's a one-party state, like we've seen in some East African countries, or it's a military authoritarian state, like we've seen in many West African countries. A transition occurred. But transitions actually happened with certain expectations by citizens. And this expectation largely has to also do with their social economic conditions, where people expect that their life will be better off under democracy. But unfortunately, life is not getting better under this, and there's a tendency for people to accuse democracy of being the problem, rather than actually other things that actually is helping in driving this democracy that we are talking about. And this is probably what is informing some of those conversations and the narrative that we're seeing increasingly, including some of the coups that we're experiencing or we've experienced in some West African countries in recent times. So basically, that's the driving force, and that's where it comes from. And for it coming from Obasanjo in particular, I remember some of us were involved in some of those conversations. Obasanjo's first few years after his presidency has been committed to democracy itself, talking about sustainability of democracy in Africa. I think this sudden change was probably in the last 1 year or so, or probably after the last general elections, and he's beginning to also question some of his positions previously, and begin to ask for what probably he's referring to Afro Democracy, whatever that means, and I think I joined Prof in asking for a proper explanation on the details around it. But you can understand the context on where these conversations is probably coming from. But this is my take. You see, many times we look at democracy based on certain normative frameworks and structures. But again, democracy is not simply about that. Democracy also has to do with certain values. You cannot have a democracy in a society where people don't espouse the values of democracy. The values are the software that drives the systems. The normative structures and frameworks that are put in place are largely the hardwares. So when you have a hardware and you don't have the software, you don't have a system. It doesn't work. So the same way, even if you have the software and you don't have the hardware, it does not run. So you need both the software and the hardware to work together organically for you to actually have a system. So when you have people who are running, you have a democracy without Democrats. So you don't necessarily blame democracy for that. You need to look at what informed the disconnect. Why would you have a democracy and you don't have Democrats to run it? Because for you to have Democrats, you need people who espouse certain values of democracy. Values of accountability, values of transparency, values that runs with humility, basic values that sustains the system. That is the glue.
The software.
So that's the software.
As you described it.
Yes, that's the
Okay.
software of a democracy. So you don't have it, so you don't blame the democracy. What you need to do is to develop that software that will help to drive it.
Sure.
So and that is what is undermining the governance model that we have within that same democratic framework. It is not about Afro conversations. I actually think that sometimes when we over-celebrate the past, it's probably also because we don't bother to study the past and what happened. And it is not about being Eurocentric or being more celebrating of what you have in the developed world and all that. Democracy comes with certain values. Look, human rights. Human rights is very important in every society. So you can't say that some societies should enjoy rights and others should not enjoy rights.
Okay, Dr. Abdul, let me bring in Dr. Tanko, Professor Tanko Baba at this stage. I'm sure that you have listened to both Prof and Dr. Abdul, and the question is, should we be looking back to move forward, or should we, from where we are at the moment, as Prof puts it, begin to think of how to remodel what we have now and move forward?
Both ways. Both ways. We can't make any significant progress without looking back. We cannot also make any significant progress without looking at our current situation. You know, Dr. Abdul was emphasizing about the system stress with democracy, even in places where it was invented. I mean, even in places where democracy has actually usually delivered the goods expected of it at the framework of governance. We should remember that democracy is just one out of numerous frameworks of governance, and that we know that democracy as a system of government, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of Berlin Wall, appeared to be the greatest of all promises, the only game in town, the framework that has the potential of facilitating sustainable human development, the promise of economic growth, you know, and the promise of guaranteeing fundamental human rights, participation, accountability, transparency, and of course, entrenching the rights of the public to determine how their affairs are governed. You know, so there was this mad rush for democracy to say that as soon as there is transition to democracy, it will translate into development, it will translate into guaranteeing fundamental human rights, it will translate into accountability, it will translate into transparency, it will translate into rule of law. But that isn't the case, and particularly with Africa. And the case with African societies and African states is even more, more catastrophic and disastrous with democracy. Instead of, singing and dancing to celebrate the fall of dictators, we replaced one set of dictators with others, largely on account that our institutions that nurtures, or the institutions that ought to nurture democracy, these institutions, are not only weak, but they are actually, at the mercy of strong men, if you like, in African politics. And those strong men have actually taken democracy and the populace in Africa to hostage. And therefore, there are, periodically and at regular intervals, there have been elections and changes of government or continuation of government after government, but then that promise of accountability, that promise of transparency, that promise of economic growth, that promise of the rule of law, which is to be explained in the context of equality of all before the law, supremacy of the Constitution, and fundamental human rights, all have not been delivered by democracy in Africa. Then we begin to say, what model is more fitted to Africa? It's not a question of model, but it's really, generally, the question of whether or not the populace in Africa are actually, in tune with the ideals of democracy, and not only copying the practices, the framework, the models that exist elsewhere in developed world that have actually delivered the goods expected of it as a framework of governance, but customizing those frameworks and models to suit the conditions and circumstances of African societies. That has not been done much. And because we are into copy and paste, and that our attitudes and our political behavior and culture have not actually transformed to accept democracy as the most preferred framework of governance that can facilitate human development, then of course we have structures, we have processes, we have practices. Those practices, structures, and processes were not actually in a real sense, real time and in a real sense, delivering the goods that are close to what democracy as a framework of governance is. For instance, we talk about election, which is key to participation and the involvement of the public in the determination of who governs, whether at the level of individual, at the level of parties, at the level of coalition. Then we look at the framework of elections in the country, and then we provide a premise upon which we audit how elections are organized, how elections are conducted, how elections are reacted to. We come to realize that a lot much needs to be done. There is complete disconnect between the people who determines who govern and the people who actually govern, who supposedly are elected by the people. We think now, in elections, we talk about institutions. The foremost of these institutions in the electoral process are the political parties. Now, we look at the foundations of those political parties. We look at the ideological framework within which these political parties are formed. We look at also the membership and ownership of political parties. We look at the party finance. We look at also the internal party democracy. We look at also the electioneering campaigns. We look at the contributions of the rank and files in the party, in parties, to say the funding of the party, the way in which the parties are organized, the elections within the parties, the candidate selection process, the campaign, programs of the party, the ideological framework establishing the parties, and so on and so forth. But
Okay,
we
but
realize that parties in Africa are just
Professor, what I hear from you is that the Western liberal democratic systems are not necessarily bad in themselves, but in the way they have been practiced in African societies. The failure of African politicians to adapt them to their various societies to deliver the expected services that a democracy is expected to provide.
Yes.
And that
Yeah.
and that necessarily the models are not bad in themselves, but in those who have infused other values into them in African societies. Prof, that's probably what I have heard from. Now, is that the case? You have been
I
a
agree.
practitioner,
Yes.
and you are a theoretician in this area.
I agree entirely. And that sums up what we've been saying, all the three of us. What I said before is that I really didn't understand what new addition the Afro, quote and unquote, was introducing to the democracy. So democracy is democracy. Whether it is what the liberal democracy or Afro democracy, what underlines them, the common thing is that it's a democratic system. And as we said, the problem is not with the system as such, but with the operators. My colleague here, Doctor, had talked about the difference between the hardware and the software. The problem is not really the system that you are operating, but the operators of the system. And here I would differ a little bit from you. You isolated the politicians. It's not just the politicians.
No.
It includes the public servants. Because the politicians who is stealing money cannot do it without the connivance of civil servants. Then the judiciary is also there. Talking about the rule of law and all this, recently, was it last week, there was a report from the NJC and some judges were indicted. So you also need to get the judiciary involved, even though they are not politicians.
So all the practitioners.
All the practitioners. The Constitution is there, the democratic institutions are there, but the practitioners have to have the right orientation, have to imbibe the tenets of democracy, have to understand how the system will work, the responsibility that they hold to ensure that the system works for the benefit of the generality of the people. That, to me, is what is lacking. So whether you call it liberal democracy, Afro democracy, unless you get this right, you will never succeed. You will only end up experimenting with one model or another. So the challenge, to me, would be how do you put systems in place to ensure that the operators do what is right and they serve the people rather than serving themselves. That, to me, is the main challenge, not changing the system.
All right, Dr. Abdul, a disconnect between systems and practitioners. That seems to be...
That's the core of the issue. But I would like to add to the list of that Prof has put on the table, to also add citizens. And that sometimes we patronize citizens and think they are much better than the other side. And I don't think so. Working in this sector for a while, being involved in all the major advocacies and elections and others for a while, it's increasingly also clear that, again, the nature of our citizens and the character of their expressions of their citizenship does not also help our democracy. Our politicians then drop from the heaven. They actually part of the larger society. But when you have a society that is broken, you can just get anything out of that society. So, our kind of expectations from our politicians, yes, you can say there are a lot of abuses and accountability is very difficult, but how we express ourselves and also demand for this accountability is also not helping the system. And that's important. So take, for instance, when we talk about our expectations from democracy, yes, people don't eat democracy. Democracy probably have to put food on the table, and that has always been the question, and that has been the debate around Africa. And why we are getting this reversal in Africa is because democracy has not met the socio-economic expectations of the people. But again, we run a democracy where what we expect are always very palpable physical things at all times. And therefore, our emphasis has always been on that, and then we don't emphasize on the soft side that can help to sustain the democracy. That is even very, very important for that sustenance process. So you have a governor, you don't have schools, you don't have hospitals, but all he's interested in is overhead flyover bridges, legacy projects. What he could say, during my time, we did this. But he wouldn't invest in education, invest in health services, because those ones can go up resources, but they are not physically palpable. You can't feel them in the immediate, and the result
impact.
So those kind of invisible things are what we're not interested in. The one that we try to strengthen system,
and they are the building blocks of
and
democracy.
those are the building blocks of democracy. But even citizens themselves, if there's sometime, or some citizens, I don't want to generalize, if they don't see those physical things, sometimes they just say, like, what is this man doing? He's been there for this number of years, we haven't seen anything. That anything that they have not seen is that they have not seen one physical structure here and there. Look at what happened. Governors,
it's not working.
It's not working. It's just not working. Because what they are looking for is something physical. So a governor can decide to say, my state house is not beautiful and it's not befitting. And then he spent billions and trillions of resources to build a new state house. And people clap.
And demolish the old one.
Demolish the old one and say, this, why do you need that in the first place? So those are the kind of thing. But this doesn't also mean that the structure of the delivery of our democracy is probably suit our political and economic system. The question I always ask myself, look, we run a federal system. There are not same types of federal systems in the world. People try to tailor their federal structure to suit them, because you can't separate our so-called democracy and our federal structure and how we run it. It's a combination of so many things. So isolating one and flogging it without looking at the others does not make sense. So for me, of Nigeria of today, does it make sense for me to run a democracy or a political system or a federal structure that have 36 state House of Assembly with a bicameral legislation at the center? Does it make sense? Can I probably have, and I'm not making a position, I'm just saying what conversation we should be talking about. Can I run a unicameral legislation at the center and probably get each state to be represented at the center by members of the state House of Assembly? Instead of running another elections, have some people seated at the state. They are state people. They have already been elected at the state. Can we draw our members of the National Assembly from that state House of Assembly to come to the National Assembly?
So that's another model.
It's not a democracy. It's about the structure of delivering the democracy.
Yes.
You understand? Because sometimes what we are talking about is actually not democracy. It's the governance structure that manages that democracy is what we are complaining about. It's not actually democracy. When you read the literature and you look at people who are exposing this thing, you find out that what they are talking about is actually not democracy per se. It's the structure that we're using to deliver this democracy. I just put one on the table.
That's right.
Yeah.
Let's bounce that off, Professor Baba. At the moment, there are members of Nigeria's House of Representatives who are going around, and in fact, it is during one of such sessions that former President Obasanjo came up with this concept of Afro Democracy. And they are, in fact, seeking to return to the parliamentary system of government. I want to do away with the presidential system of government. From what Dr. Abdul has said, is it really the political system that is failing, or indeed it is the practitioners who are not adapting those systems to the peculiarities of their various countries and societies?
I think it's a combination of two. One, we must understand that parliamentary system of government is just another variant of democratic framework. We have had it in the First Republic and it collapsed tragically. So I think the argument is that the parliamentary system of government is less expensive, it's less costly, it's more consensus, it's a consensus building framework. It brings people much more closer together. It's a system that guarantees, that frees resources for development, and also is built on the framework of consensus of, close consultation between and among different shades of political opinions and so on and so forth. And of course, it is often argued that, with the burden of expenditure on the governance process in the country, a return to parliamentary system of government will also provide avenues for Nigeria's democratic government and governance framework to have resources that are free. But let me also give a little rider to what Dr. Abdul has just said about a system and, of course, the practitioners. Both of these are very essential, regardless of what system, what variant of democracy we have adopted. I think what we require most and what exists elsewhere where democracy works, largely have been strong, committed, and patriotic citizens. The citizens and the citizenry are the building blocks of democracy and any framework of governance. I tell you that today, democracy is not working in Africa because our institutions are weak. Weak institutions means that rules, regulations that actually invent systems and institutions are not tenaciously adhered to. And it is given and natural that people that are actually trusted with power have the tendency to abuse that power. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And then what is required is that power and the trusted people with power to be checked regularly. And that if citizens are the most important segment of the society that provides that checks required to ensure that systems are built, systems are strengthened, institutions are built, and institutions are strengthened. And the citizens generally, their active involvement in the way in which affairs of a particular country or a system is run is very key to having to shape how practitioners, operate a particular system. Now, we talk about accountability, we talk about transparency, we talk about rule of law. And you look at the 1999 Constitution, the framers of the 1999 Constitution have not erred as far as accountability, transparency, and rule of law is concerned. But how are these laws provided in the constitutions enforced? That is where the mess relies. Now, if the citizens are well aware, committed, patriotic, and they develop themselves into platforms for civil society organizations, and they are very alive and active in their participation as to how the system or democracy or governance is run in the country, they will be in a better position to ask questions, to demand answers, and to insist that rules, regulations that actually brings into existence institutions are tenaciously and strictly adhered to. If this is done, the operators of the Constitution, the operators of institutions, the practitioners in governance have no option than to actually stick to rules, regulations that actually entrusted them with power and authority to govern on behalf of the people. So now, the consciousness of the citizens, the level of enlightenment of the citizenship and the patriotism of the citizenship, I think, is one area that the African states and African societies are lacking. And that explains why we have huge governance deficit in Africa, even when democracy is in place, compared to what exists in other parts of the world where the citizens are active. Not only active, but are also engaged and involved in the governance process. When you look at different sectors of the economy, Abdul is saying that governors at different levels of the state are involved. People will gauge and audit and evaluate governance performance on the basis of what structures, fiscal structures are put in place, regardless of whether or not rules and regulations are adhered to. incurring expenditure, transparency, accountability, and certain principles of probity are adhered to in the way in which these projects are executed. So what I'm saying in essence, transition from presidential system of government to parliamentary system of government, if failed, will not actually deliver this country, or will not get us to the promised land.
All right, Professor Baba, thank you so much. Let me bring in Professor Osumbo now. He's a professor of law, and the message I'm getting here from Professor Baba is that the weak legal frameworks of African constitutions are contributory to the problems of democracy in Africa.
Well, the constitutional legal framework, I do not see the framework itself as very deficient. Take our Constitution, for instance. It's modeled along the US Constitution. So if it is working for them in the US, why is it not working for us in Nigeria? So it boils down to the human factor. But let me just quickly talk about the parliamentary thing, and to agree with the prof who just spoke. Parliamentary system works very well for some people because those operating it operate it in a way that it serves their people. Parliamentary system can work successfully. Presidential system works successfully for people who want it to work successfully for them and conduct governance in accordance with the dictates of their the presidential constitution that they have. The problem of Nigeria is that we tried the parliamentary system before and it failed. Those who are advocating that we return to parliamentary system seems to forget that we started off with a parliamentary system. Under the 1960 constitution, it operated for only about 3 years before it was changed with the Republican Constitution in 1963, and it worked only for 2.5 years before it was overthrown by the military. It failed. So if you are saying we should return to the parliamentary system, have you asked yourself, why did the parliamentary system that we started off with fail? What have we now done in between 1966 and now to ensure that if we return to the parliamentary system, it's not going to fail as it failed before? And I will be very reluctant to say that a parliamentary system that failed after only 2.5 years, between 1963 and 1966, is superior to a presidential system that we have managed to utilize for 24 years. If you ask me, the system that Nigeria has managed to practice and has served us, though not satisfactorily, for 24 years is superior.
More than 24 years, because I mean, in the Second Republic, it was adopted.
Exactly.
I mean,
so definitely it is superior to the parliamentary system, given that factor alone. And then talking about the legal framework of the Constitution, that is why, again, I say that the human factor is responsible. The prof also mentioned that the foundation of the democratic system of governance are political parties. But where you have political parties in Nigeria not even subjecting themselves to the discipline of the constitution that they have given to themselves, then there's a problem. And that problem is compounded because the judiciary refuses to enforce the political party constitutions. They will say, oh, it's internal affairs. They don't want to bother themselves with the internal affairs of the political parties. But a constitution, whether it is the constitution of a club, social club, or constitution of a religious organization, or even the articles of association of a registered company, constitute a contract which binds the members and the entity together and are enforceable by the courts. But a situation where you find Nigerian courts say, no, it's internal affairs, we are not going to look into dispute between the parties, is a major problem, which I hope that the judiciary, I know the volume of work, the pressure of work on judges is tremendous. So maybe at any opportunity that they can say, these politicians, let them go and sort themselves out. So long as they adopt that attitude, they are not playing the role that they should be playing to keep the political parties in check.
And the political parties themselves are some of the building blocks of a virile democracy.
They are. The foundation is fielding candidates for election, canvassing votes for them, getting them elected, and handing over governance responsibility to them. If the foundation is weak, you can't build on it. Unfortunately, that is a major factor inhibiting the progress of governance in Nigeria today. And I want to urge again that judges, those who are inclined to say, no, even though what has been done, they complain, is in violation of the constitution of the political parties, which the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria mandates every political party must have its constitution registered with INEC. But when dispute comes, a member will say, my political party failed to abide by the provision of the Constitution. Because we say, no, it's internal affairs. We don't want to bother.
All right.
That is a major
Okay.
problem.
Dr. Abdul, can you do this in 50 seconds?
Yeah, I think I want to agree with my the colleagues on this table that, look, the challenge, probably what we are all saying is that, yes, democracy is under stress all over the world, but it has nothing to do in itself with the democracy, the values, the principle, and the framework for delivery. But we can trace some of the challenges and the complaints that people are making from either this economic framework or the people or the system that is actually being used to deliver the democracy.
Okay.
And therefore, if we want to make any change, it's for us to look at, because there is no perfect system anywhere. But jumping from this one to the next one and all that is not what is going to solve our problem. Democracy, look, every system is a work in progress. It's for us to continue to work really hard to perfect some of those things. And the issues put on the table by the two profs and myself are very germane, and these are things that we should be dealing with.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Professor Yaya Tanko Baba, as a professor of political institutions and comparative politics at the Department of Political Science, Usmanu Danfodio University in Sokoto. Thank you for joining us all the way from Sokoto on the program. Dr. Hussein Abdul is a political scientist and country director, CARE. Thank you so much for giving us your time, even though you were just arriving back in the country. And Professor Sareme Osumbo, former governor of Edo State, a former distinguished senator, and of course a renowned professor of law. Thank you so much for your time. And to you, our viewers out there, we want to thank you for investing your time with us. Please join us again when we bring you a fresh edition of People, Politics, and Power.